is Robert Chapman. He's a philosopher as well. He uses the term neurodivergent philosopher. He did his PhD on ethics of autism at the University of Essex. Currently, he works on topics as neurodiversity, of course, disability and mental disorder. He leads also the Health and Wellbeing for Neurodiverged Age research project at the University of Bristol. And today he will give a presentation with the title Neurodiversity, Objectivity and Relativism. The floor is yours, Robert. Can you unmute yourself? We don't hear you yet.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yeah, great.
Hi, thanks, sorry. And can you see my screen too?
Yeah.
Good, okay, thank you so much. I will get started. So, hi, thanks so much for having me. And also thank you to everyone who's come to watch and listen to. I was really excited to hear Jana's talk, actually, because I think it fits really well with mine in important ways, especially this move from intrinsic kind of dysfunction towards a relational conception. Although I use the term dysfunction whereas the term deficit was used in the previous talk. But the focus of my talk is different, and as you see from the name, neurodiversity, objectivity, relativism, I'm concerned with the kind of claims neurodiversity proponents such as myself make, and whether we can say that in some sense these are kind of objective claims, or whether, as some critics have claimed, that they just kind of rely on this crude form of relativism, and maybe from a scientific perspective are actually very unconvincing and are just kind of bad science or maybe pseudoscience or something like that. So I'm not going to find neurodiversity. I'm just going to mention 3 claims that I think pretty much all advocates will share. Maybe there are 1 or 2 who don't, but I think possibly all do, and most certainly would, even though we disagree on loads of other things all of the time. So the first is what I'll call the social model claim, and that's that in some important sense, much of the kind of distress and disablement that neurodivergent people experience arises in large part because of the social context, by which I include barriers and also kind of stigma and attitudes and general kind of structural ableism and so forth. Now, I'll leave open which variant of the social models, because there's loads people prefer. So whether it's the traditional British one or more kind of interactional and relational models, that's fine. I'm not committing to any particular one, but I think we all agree that some version of these is appropriate. The second claim, what I'll call the positive value claim, is that in some important sense, neurodiversity, and including neurodivergence, is a valuable part of human diversity that should be accepted and celebrated in many ways. And importantly as well, I think conserved, right? We shouldn't try to eliminate neurodivergence. We should try and conserve it. And thirdly, and this is the claim I'm going to focus most on today, is what I call the non-pathological claim. And this is the claim that many mental disabilities have been wrongly pathologized. And in fact, they're not actually what we might call dysfunctional or pathological. So I'm going to use the terms dysfunctional and pathological synonymously today. So if I mean the same thing by them. And what I mean by this is that objectively, in some sense, you can say something is objectively pathological or it's not. And many neurodiversity proponents, I think, will claim that, say, autism or other forms of neurodivergence aren't inherently pathological. Now, the reason I'm focusing on the third one is that I think the first 2 have been very well established. Loads of people have written on these in really great detail, and I think there's a quite coherent response from neurodiversity proponents on these matters. As I say, even if we disagree on details, these are claims which have been forwarded in quite a coherent way by loads of different people. But it's really important to say that the non-pathological claim has been, I think, less coherently and directly argued for. And at least some proponents seem to think that the third one kind of logically follows once you establish 1 and 2. So once you establish that the social model works better than the medical model, and once you establish that there's positive value as well as problems, that it follows that X, Y, Z disability is not pathological. But that doesn't actually logically follow in any way. You can establish both of the first two claims, and it could still be the case that a given disability is pathological, right? And of course, you see this when, this is clearest, I think, when people apply the social model to their physical disabilities, which they might say the social model works better, and that there are some positive aspects of it, but they'll still say, well, it is an illness. Not always, but there are at least some cases of that. So I think this is the point where we get charges of kind of relativism or bad science from critics. And I've seen these from loads of critics, members of the public, but also scientists and researchers. So here's an example from Mohib Kostandi, who is a neuroscientist, and he's very much against neurodiversity. So this is a quote of his from, he was interviewed for the BBC News, who did a kind of article on neurodiversity, and he kind of came in as the generic critic, and he said, "I'm strongly of the opinion that the vocabularies of neurodiversity proponents are not valid terms, and they actually have very little use to us as neuroscientists." He also wrote an article in the same year called Against Neurodiversity, where he just basically comes out and he kind of says, look, I'm a neuroscientist and I understand neurological pathology, and what neurodiversity proponents are saying is just completely at odds with the scientific understanding of the world and what most scientists would think. So that's a vehement critic, I call it. And just to give another example, Roy Richard Grinker is what I would call a friendly critic. So Grinker is an anthropologist who on the whole has been, I think, very supportive of much of the neurodiversity kind of claims that we make and so forth. And I think he's influenced lots of neurodiversity proponents as well, because he wrote a really good book on autism. But he also, as a kind of friendly critic, sometimes thinks that we can go too far. So here he is in 2015 saying, scientists, it could be argued, frequently mistake social distinctions for biological ones. Neurodiversity advocates, it could be argued, do the opposite. So he's kind of agreeing here, to put it in context, he's saying when neurodiversity proponents have often criticized a standard scientific or psychiatric view of, say, autism or other disabilities, often the neurodiversity criticisms are good, the ones that we make, I mean, but sometimes we go too far in the other direction. Sorry, my PowerPoint seems to be skipping ahead on its own, so if I'll just go back, but if it keeps jumping around, that's why. So Grinker's, as I say, is a friendly critic, so he's mostly supportive, but even, I'm just including this to show that even people quite friendly and supportive of the movement, but who are still quite scientifically minded, think that sometimes proponents can go a bit too far. So just to understand this worry, I'm going to say a bit about what I call the individualist or evolutionary framework of pathology or dysfunction. And this is the general framework used in medicine and concepts of, health and pathology. And that's in, for somatic or mental health. So in medicine more broadly, including psychiatry. And although there are differences in specific models, the general, to put it very, very generally, the thought is this, that we have different organs and they each evolve to fulfill a certain function, and that is their natural function, and in some sense that's objective. And if the organ or any kind of other subsystem of your body fails to fulfill that function and can't do that, and if that impedes your fitness in the evolutionary Darwinian sense, then objectively you will have some kind of pathology or dysfunction. So to give a very simple and clear example, the human heart evolved to pump blood around the body. And that's what it needs to do for us to be healthy. And if it stops doing that or slows down or speeds up too much, we'll become, very ill and in danger of actually dying. So you need it to do that. And based on this kind of general analysis, which is taken from evolutionary biology, philosophers and medical researchers and theorists have made kind of models to try and make more generalizations about where, when something becomes a pathology. So you gather data and then you try and make statistical averages. So this is the thought that maybe the healthy range of your BPM for your heart would be between 50 and 100 beats per minute. And if it goes over or above, although there are some cases in which that can be healthy, in many cases, you should be very worried and go to the doctor. And then the thought is that we can have a similar kind of analysis for all of our organs, including the brain, of course. Now, the brain is much more complex in many ways than the heart. The heart has one very clearly defined function, whereas the brain, we use it for all sorts of things. But the thought is still that maybe we don't fully understand the brain yet, but ultimately there are going to be some objective natural functions, and that anyone who accepts Darwin's theory of natural selection will have to kind of acknowledge this, even if we get things wrong sometimes, and even if there are very controversial cases like body mass index and some cases in psychiatry. Proponents of this model will say, of course we get things wrong sometimes, but ultimately there are natural functions and dysfunctions. So I think this is the kind of reason people might be skeptical of the non-pathological claim, and this is what we need to challenge if we want to convincingly defend a neurodiversity perspective. So I'll now go through responses from neurodiversity proponents to try and respond to this. So the first response I've often seen, or sometimes seen at least, from neurodiversity proponents is to embrace a kind of quite radical constructivism about the concept of functioning or dysfunction or pathology. So the claim opponents of this move make is something like this. All concepts of function and dysfunction are merely social constructs, and there's no hope of anything remotely approaching objectivity on these issues. Now, I can see why some people might be tempted by this, and I think there's something to some extent right about this. And it's really important to acknowledge that. So all of our kind of psychiatric constructs and our medical practice surely is value laden. It's got a normative element, and it's often kind of ideologically laden as well. There are lots of kind of grey areas where we seem to have pathologized normal variations and things like this. So it's really important to point out these kind of elements of constructivism and normativist and ideological elements. But I think we can only go so far in this direction. And it's quite hard to deny that there is some possibility of a kind of objective dysfunction of the brain. So an example of this, I think, is fairly clear. By the way, I've spoken to many other neurodiversity proponents about this, and I haven't found anyone who disagrees with this yet. So I think most neurodiversity proponents would probably agree with me, is that infant anencephaly is, in some objective sense, just a neurological dysfunction. It's a pathology. So for anyone who doesn't know what infant anencephaly is, it's where when an infant is developing in the womb, basically your brain and skull don't develop properly. And if you survive to birth, you tend to only live for a few hours or a day, and often in quite terrible pain. And then you can't survive any longer than that. We don't have any technology to do anything about that. So whereas I'm much more pro kind of social model and to some extent more constructivist approach to when it comes to, say, autism or the schizophrenic spectrum and so forth, I kind of have to admit that in this case, infant anencephaly, I just kind of happy to say objectively that's a neurological pathology, and it's just kind of inherently bad, and there aren't any redeeming features of it. So I think we can't go too far towards constructivism. We have to have a nuanced constructivism, not a really kind of radical constructivism. And secondly, just a practical problem as an advocate and thinking about what has utility, I'm not sure taking this approach actually has much utility from an advocacy perspective, because if we want to convince scientifically minded people to get on board, I just don't think they're going to listen to this kind of approach. So we have to be kind of nuanced constructivists and really point out these kind of ways that our concepts of the normal brain and stuff are ideologically and normatively laden, but not go too far towards a kind of radical constructivism. So I won't take this route myself. So on to a second response I've seen from many other neurodiversity proponents is to accept the objectivity of the evolutionary framework, but then to claim that it has been badly applied in certain instances. So this move is to go almost in the opposite direction, to basically accept that the models that are standardly used are valid models, but then to say our information about certain so-called conditions is incorrect since we have focused mostly on deficits and we've overlooked benefits. So this is taken by some neurodiversity proponents, and I think some scientists and researchers who have been kind of sympathetic to the movement. And people who make this kind of argument are the ones who say things like this: "Oh, you think that say autism is just a deficit, but we've overlooked the kind of strengths that come with it." And then they'll point towards studies which show traits which could be seen as adaptive. And then they'll say, from an evolutionary perspective, you can give a kind of cost analysis, cost-benefit analysis, and say that on the whole, you can see, autism or ADHD or whatever else as a kind of adaptation. So this is completely the opposite to the embracing constructivism route. And I think this will be a lot more convincing to kind of scientifically minded people, because as long as you can show them the evidence, they should revise their beliefs and say, okay, maybe I got this wrong. Maybe, some manifestations of neurodivergence are actually adaptations and aren't inherently pathological. Still, I'm also going to reject this as a good kind of basis for responding to this criticism. The first problem, I've skipped ahead. The first problem is that I think it's too conservative. And what I mean by that is that what I think most neurodiversity paradigm proponents, including myself, have been calling for is what we sometimes call a paradigm shift, which is to say a totally different way of thinking about psychological ability and disability, which is very different to the standard way. But I don't think this is a paradigm shift at all if you take this route. And if anything, this actually just kind of affirms and reinforces the dominant paradigm, because what it does, it says, well, the dominant paradigm is actually correct, but you've just been not very careful at applying it in some instances. So that doesn't really change anything. And if we take this route, I'm not really sure what the point of neurodiversity would be, because it doesn't really change anything. It's just asking scientists to be a bit more careful in taking, noting kind of adaptive strengths as well as limitations. Secondly, as an activist, I think as a pragmatic problem is that if you do rely on this to make your arguments about neurodiversity, to establish the non-pathology claim, it will lead to quite an exclusive and elitist conception of neurodiversity. Because I think you can make these kind of cost-benefit analysis evolutionary arguments for very specific disabilities in those instances where they're kind of coupled with, a spiky profile and very high cognitive abilities in some areas, coupled with lower ones in the other areas, as it were. And that might work for some kind of specific manifestations of autism or dyslexia or so forth. But for any more complex disabilities, it's going to be a lot harder to make this kind of argument, and anyone with a more complex disability will be excluded by this route. So that's another more kind of ethical and practical reason, I think, for not taking this route either. Okay, so just to summarize so far, I've outlined the problem and I've looked at two responses from some neurodiversity proponents, or which I'd seen some people take. And I've said that one of them's too radical in a way which is unconvincing, I think, and one of them's far too conservative in a way which is not very helpful either. And I'm going to try and take something of a middle ground and offer an alternative. So my proposed solution is to offer an ecological framework. So what do I mean by that? Well, my core claim is going to be this. The individualist evolutionary kind of models or frameworks that we use standardly for thinking about functional, dysfunctional health or pathology might be appropriate for thinking about the human heart or other organs, but they're not very appropriate often, and often they miss a lot. If you use them, they miss out a lot of data if you apply them to human mental functioning. In fact, these models just might not be very good for human mental functioning, and maybe we should have a different model instead, which is better from a scientific perspective, but also consistent with a kind of neurodiversity paradigm framing. So just to say why I think an ecological framework, and I'll explain what I mean by that more as we go on, is consistent with a neurodiversity paradigm framing, I'll just note some quotes from early neurodiversity proponents, and in fact the people who coined the concept in the first place, which is Judy Singer, who is mainly attributed with coining it, and Harvey Bloom, who had some influence as well. So to quote Harvey Bloom, this is the first ever article where the term appeared in print, by the way, and it's a very famous quote for those, if anyone hasn't heard it. He says, "Neurodiversity may be every bit as crucial for the human race as biodiversity is for life in general, and who can say what form of wiring will prove best at any given moment." Now note here that he's making this analogy of biodiversity. He's not talking about evolution. He's very much more taking the perspective of an ecologist who study biodiversity and who are interested in conservation. And the last question, who can say what form of wiring will prove best at any given moment, is a kind of inviting us to conserve forms of neurodivergence. That even if we think, some people think they aren't functional at the moment, we just don't know how the world's going to change and so forth. So this is taking much more of a kind of ecological perspective. Similarly, Judy Singer, in her original thesis, she used concepts like niche contribution, which is an ecological concept, and she even used the term ecological society to describe her vision of what a neurodiversity-friendly society was like. And she's actually clarified more recently in a blog post. She says, "My concept of neurodiversity was based on a generally accepted principle of biodiversity, that the most stable environments are those that are most diverse, and every species has a necessary part to play in the whole." So I think very importantly, what these early proponents were doing is moving away in some important sense from individualist Darwinian perspective and towards an ecological perspective. Ecologists, when they look at different organisms or species and talk about functions and dysfunctions, they actually have a very different view to evolutionary biologists. They don't kind of go, let's compare these different organisms and see who's the fittest in a Darwinian sense, who would survive. They rather say, what role does this organism play in the broader complex system? What role does this species play in the broader system, and how do we look at the interactions between the organisms? So it's more of a relational or interactional concept of function or dysfunction. So in the philosophy of science, there's actually been some recent work looking and clarifying talk of function and dysfunction in ecology and how it differs from function and functional analysis in evolutionary biology. And it's worth noting in particular, I think, three differences. So the first difference is that in evolutionary biology, function or dysfunction or health or pathology is always intrinsic, or usually. So that's in the sense that, if I've got a dysfunctional brain, it's just intrinsic. The problem is a problem in my brain. By contrast, functions in ecology are what we might call relational or emergent. That is, they emerge out of the interactions between organisms. So they're never intrinsic to an organism. You don't say that organism's dysfunctional from an ecological perspective, but you might talk of there being dynamics or problems or good things, functions of the ecosystem. And this is, I think it's fits well, I hope, with the kind of thing Jana was pointing towards, talking about problems as relational between people, for instance, rather than within the autistic person. So if we apply it to minds, I think an ecological conception of dysfunction is better in an important sense and fits with this kind of insight. A second key difference is that evolutionary biology functional analysis is backwards looking, while in ecology it's forwards looking. So what I mean by that is that the function of an organ in evolutionary biology is always defined by asking why was it selected by natural history. So the function of the heart will be defined by why the kind of effects that the heart had, which led to it being selected for, in contrast to okay, I just saw a message on the chat, which I just looked at quickly. Where was I? So you're defined by looking backwards. By contrast, in ecology, it's more about what might be good in certain possible futures in a changing environment. So the functions aren't defined by where you came from, as it were, and by your genesis, but by looking into the future and saying, we need to conserve this, and this is why, because the environment might be changing. And I think that's what Bloom was kind of hinting towards when he said, like, who knows what kind of mind will be best at any given moment. And thirdly, and finally, very importantly, in evolutionary biology, function and dysfunction are always focused on the individual and about their individual survival and reproduction, or the individual's genes, more specifically. Whereas in ecology, the focus is more on group or system robustness. So you look at what it takes for a group or a broader system of organisms to have a kind of robustness. And I think we see something more similar to this in what neurodiversity proponents are saying. So just to say a bit, I'm going to finish in about 5 minutes, by the way, so I'm coming towards the end. I just want to say a little bit about recent research on group functioning and so-called cognitive diversity. So in the last few years, 3 or 4 years, for whatever reason, people in sort of business and management studies have become interested in what they call cognitive diversity. And that's a slightly different concept in neurodiversity. And what it just means is it's a group property. And if a group is cognitively diverse, that means there's more different kinds of minds within that group to the other minds within that group. And if it's more cognitively uniform, that means all the people in the group think very similarly to each other. And the people who are doing this research are actually just concerned with like business stuff, which I'm not concerned with. So they're interested in what kind of companies will survive or fail and stuff like that. But I think they've got findings which are very relevant for thinking about neurodiversity too. So quite consistent findings is that cognitive diversity in groups is much better for the functioning of those groups in important ways than cognitive uniformity. So Reynolds and Lewis found that cognitive diversity helped groups solve complex problems that arise in shifting and uncertain environments. And they found there was a direct correlation between how cognitively diverse a group was and how good they were at solving these complex problems. So that's a very similar thing you see with a complex kind of biodiversity and being robust in relation to shifting environment. Another similar study, Agarwal et al., they found that cognitive diversity helps group intelligence. That's what the term they use. Generally, at least up to a certain point, and this is quite interesting, if the diversity gets too much within a group, there can be communication breakdown, and then that can impede the group intelligence. But generally, cognitive diversity was helpful for group intelligence, but you can also see these relational kind of dysfunctions as well that might emerge there. And similarly, Chen et al. Found that cognitive diversity increased group reflexivity. That's quite a similar point to the one made by Reynolds and Lewis. So I think this is interesting to think about because all this kind of group perspective and group functioning stuff is completely missed on individualist kind of evolutionary models, which are all just about the functioning of the individual, but miss out often broader dynamics. But if we take an ecological model, we have much more room to think about these kind of group dynamics and how actually the functions of human mental functions might be something that emerge within groups in some sense or between people. And also that cognitive and neurological diversity might be good from this perspective. It might actually be functional. And that includes, of course, disabilities. And it's interesting to kind of consider the implicit implications people might take from taking these different kind of models and paradigms. Because if you take an individualist model, you think that being a neurotypical is the only way to be objectively healthy and neurodivergence is objectively pathological. And this kind of leads people to think that only a neurotypical society is one with objectively good functioning. And that's to say that we should make everyone neurotypical in some sense. And of course, I totally disagree with that because I believe the neurodiversity non-pathological claim, but that is what kind of follows if you take that model, or seems to anyway for many people. But if you take the ecological model and you apply it, and you can then look at group functioning and stuff, and so forth, and the ways that functioning is a kind of dynamic and relational process, you kind of reach completely, if you follow the science, you reach completely different conclusion. So you would say that a neurologically diverse society is more functional than a neurologically uniform society, right? So just as a small cognitively diverse group will be able to solve complex problems and so better than a neurologically uniform group, you would expect the same in terms of wider groups. So here, instead of a kind of notion of, I've just got slightly over time, just going to be like 2 minutes, by the way. So here, I think the kind of framework you see emerging is one which is very different to the standard individualist evolutionary model, but which still you can claim that this is, it measures something objective and out there in the world, but it's much more, I would argue, consistent with a kind of neurodiversity paradigm science. So I hope that this is a way to answer this kind of charge of being, just relativistic or not, clashing with objective fact. And I would say that in fact, this model in many ways, or this framework, would have actually greater scientific utility for talking about human mental functioning than the standard models, because it allows us to acknowledge a far greater variety of mental functions which are actually missed on the standard models. So from a scientific perspective, I would argue in many instances, this framework will actually be better than the standard models, which encounter lots of problems, I think. And just to show that it's not too conservative, so it doesn't go the other direction too far either, it's really important to point out that a relational conception of function and dysfunction completely avoids individual pathologization. So taking an ecological framework, you don't ever say this individual mind is pathological, even though you do acknowledge that relational dysfunctions might arise. For instance, what Damien Milton calls the double empathy problem, when autistic and neurotypical people struggle to understand each other. And that's a relational problem for Milton between the autistic and the neurotypical, not arising within either individual. And this should, I hope, avoid stigma and dehumanization as well. And then thirdly, finally, just as a functional model, this very much helps ground and move towards a conservationist perspective. Because as Bloom says, who knows what kind of what kind of mind will prove best at any given time. And of course, if functions are emergent, you don't want to be taking out random people and eliminating them, because it's very hard to trace how the functions emerge. And really, we just want to kind of say that from this model that more neurodiversity is a better thing rather than a worse thing. Just as the ecologist will say that more biodiversity is good. Okay, so just to end, thank you very much for listening. This is very roughly based, just to say, on a forthcoming paper of mine. which is coming out in Perspectives on Psychological Science soon, where I argue in more detail for this ecological analysis. And there is a free preprint on my ResearchGate if anyone wants to access it. So please do take that as well. And if anyone has, criticisms, please do email me. I'll be very grateful for them. So thank you very much for listening. And I'm just going to stop sharing my screen.
Thank you.